Hello everybody, welcome to our webinar. This webinar is going to look at graded qualifications within the NCFE portfolio, primarily looking at those cash qualifications typically associated with early years and childcare, and also, of course, health and social care. We're going to have a little look at the journey of students and, of course, at the teaching, learning and assessment of some of these qualifications. So we'll make comparisons between graded qualifications and not graded qualifications. We'll take a look at assessment of learning, achievement and moderation. Our small agenda will develop into an overview and a discussion. So we'll consider, what do we understand by graded qualifications? We'll take a walk through the process. We'll look at an example. And then we're going to join in with Stacey Mann, our subject specialist in early years and childcare, and Angela Rogers, our subject specialist in teaching and learning. And together with myself, Janet King, sector manager in education and childcare, we'll take a look at the different approaches that providers are using with graded qualifications, maybe looking at some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages or pitfalls that may occur along the way using some of those different approaches. So to begin with, I just want us to think for a moment about what we actually understand by graded qualifications. All qualifications carry some sort of grade, some sort of outcome. When we think about work-based or typical competency-based qualifications, those tend to fall into a sort of category of pass, refer, achieve, not yet achieved. So there's this element of grade, absolutely, but that's associated with a level of achievement, a pass, rather in contrast to a graded qualification where you've got that build of graded boundaries. And that could be pass, merit distinction, or it could be looking from an E or a D up to an A or an A star. So those are the differences in what the qualifications look like. And some qualifications, such as a technical diploma in childcare and education, have got also that license to practice, that competency based within them. But they will also carry that graded boundary. And so I think it's important just to think, can we approach both of these qualifications in the same way? I guess we could think for the teaching and learning, absolutely. Teaching and learning across early years and childcare and health and social care. There's lots of crossover, isn't there? And if you put the units together, you could see quite clearly how some of that learning will overlap with each other. And that's fair to say. When it comes to assessment, that's when it's a little bit more complex, I think, because in a typical pass, refer, achieved, not yet achieved type, competency-based type of approach, those students that are using a competency-based type qualification will be thinking about generation of evidence. They'll be creating a portfolio, and very often one piece of evidence that they create can be holistically applied across assessment criteria for other that's held within other units. There's no grade boundary to worry about. There's nothing to say, oh, okay, that's actually an example of health and safety. Are there any other points within this qualification around health and safety? Let's use that to complement that, because we're not moving it across to cover something at a higher or lower grade. We're moving it across to prove and show, illustrate competence. So there's a certain level of achievement and it's linear. And it makes things a little bit more straightforward for holistic assessment. When we think about graded qualifications, that's a little bit harder to do. So holistic teaching and delivery, absolutely. To say that health and safety, for example, may be at the core and threaded throughout the teaching and learning of different units within a graded qualification, absolutely. You're making connections there and you're helping the student to make sense of their learning. When it comes to holistic assessment, however, that's when we need to be a little bit more mindful of grade boundaries. So if we were applying that achieved, not yet achieved, competency-based pass linear approach, it would be very difficult because that health and safety requirement in Unit 1, for example, of a graded qualification may be set at a D grade, and yet when you look at where else the touch points are, they're going to be anything between the D right through to the A star. So that one piece of information is not easily mappable in a holistic way. So it's better to approach these things by thinking about the grade boundaries. And that really is what we're going to get into when we start looking at the example in a moment, because it's very important that there's an appreciation of grade boundaries for lots of different reasons. And it's also important that the assessment stays unique, if you like, and discrete to that unit. And in that way, you're avoiding those complexities of, oh, here's one piece of evidence. How can I use that across the other units? I wouldn't even contemplate that. Yes, make the connections in your teaching and learning. Yes, use the richness of that to encourage your students to reflect on what they already know. Absolutely. But it's got to be contextualized to that particular unit and to that particular grade outcome expectation. So those are the differences between the two types of qualifications. One is very sort of work-based in its element, very practical in its makeup, and the other one has often got a sort of seesaw approach with a sort of 50-50 split with knowledge and theoretical understanding with a combination of practical application. So let's take a look at an example. And the example that we're going to look at is taken from the NCFE Cash Level 3 Technical Diploma in Childcare and Education. Okay, so what we can see on the screen here now is an absolute example of an assessment of learning. And this assessment of learning takes us through the grade boundaries. So we can see for Unit 1 that we've got grade boundaries that are capturing the D criteria. And as we move down, we can see that we have grading criteria for C, for B, and for A and A star. Now, as we go to the back to the top, what we can see here is that as we look down that D criteria, D1, D2, and so on, we've got links in that second column there to the assessment criteria within the unit, within the specification. Sometimes in a work-based approach, in a non-graded, we'll call them, qualification, the student will work their way through 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 in a sort of criterion by criterion way. And we're going to discuss those different approaches with our discussion in a moment. But as you can see here, to achieve the D, it's not done in such a way. It's done to capture the breadth of the unit so that the student is able to show that they understand, they've got that theoretical knowledge and understanding at a certain level, but that level is actually covering the whole of the unit. And that's really important. So the breadth of the unit is covered at a certain depth. So by doing it sort of 1.1, 1.2, etc., you're going to be mixing around those grade boundaries. So that's something to bear in mind. So that's why you could look at an assessment of learning and you may wonder why they're not in chronological order sometimes, and that 1.2 in this particular example, I believe, is down or up in the C grade. So there it is. So you've got to be mindful of that. So this is what a typical assessment of learning looks like. Of course, graded qualifications are sometimes D to A star, they're sometimes E to A star, they're sometimes pass, merit, or distinction. But these are the qualifications that would fall into that category of graded qualifications that we're talking about today. Thank you, Stacey. I'm just going to reshare my PowerPoint, I think, because things may have gone a little bit awry there. So if I just move us along. Okay, so we've looked at that example. And so the first thing when you're thinking about and you're approaching assessment of a graded qualification is absolutely to to sort of acknowledge and appreciate the content within the unit. What's the teaching and learning about? What's the scope? Where are the connections to the unit, to the other units? Absolutely. Threading through and making connections to help the student along their journey. But then thinking about the assessment of the units in a discrete way with the assessment of learning in mind. What I'm going to do now is joining a discussion with my colleagues today, so with Stacey and Angela, and we're going to look at the different approaches. So criterion by criterion, grade boundary by grade boundary, or looking at a summative approach. So criterion by criterion is where we will start. So what we mean by criterion really is to think, oh, we're going to do the D1 or the 1.1, and then we're going to ask the student, we're going to teach that, and then perhaps ask the students to submit that. So Stacey, if I bring you in at this point, I mean, looking at that, and if we say there's no right or wrong, but if we were looking at criterion by criterion as an approach for graded qualification assessment, any thoughts?
Thank you, Janet. That was really informative. Yeah, I think it's very time consuming and complex to develop. I think the whole marking backwards and forwards of a teacher's already full workload is going to make that very, very difficult and time consuming and not really using our time effectively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we've got issues there around time. We've got issues there around perhaps not utilizing the time that we have and the limited time that we have. Angie, from a student's perspective, and anything that you want to add about the student journey and the approach of criterion by criterion, Angie?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I think that's absolutely right. Stacey, spot on with your what you said. I think from a student's point of view, I think what would happen is that you'd end up with a lot of repetition, and that could affect that student's sort of motivation levels. And it's difficult sometimes to be able to do that with the repetition, because I mean, having more of an holistic approach would be excellent, but obviously it has to be in line with the grained boundaries, which I totally understand. But it's to avoid that repetition that you sometimes get if you're doing it by criterion.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to take such a lot of time, as Stacey has said, and the students perhaps will get demotivated by, well, I've said it once, why am I going to have to say it again? So that repetition. Um, and if there are criteria, if there's, say, I don't know, there can be up to 6 or 7 D criteria or pass criteria, um, the student it's going to take, for a student, it's going to seem like it's taking forever, and they'll have another unit on the go potentially as well. And so the tutor is going to get sort of overwhelmed with the amount of work. If you've typically got 18 students, for example, in your class, then that's a lot of work going backwards and forwards. So, and not necessarily embracing the sort of the holistic approach to the teaching and learning that's going on in the assessment. And you talk about the holisticness, and I think criterion by criterion assessment can sometimes lose that connection to the unit as a whole. So it's got a place, criterion by criterion, maybe for reflection, maybe for discussion, maybe for ensuring understanding, and maybe in a work-based sort of pass, refer, or achieve, not yet achieved, I can see how some of those things may be picked up discreetly like that in an observation, for example, or in an activity, or in a professional discussion. But where they're linked to a grading boundary, as you quite rightly said, it becomes a little bit more complex, I think. So we have to be mindful of that. Okay, so now if I'm thinking about preparing for marking a graded qualification, criterion by criterion is sort of something that I might look at. I might make sure that the students are able to do that from the teaching and learning of the unit as a whole. But I'm deciding. probably going to put that one to one side. I guess criterion by criteria might be something if a student has completed the whole unit and they've actually thought about the assessment as a whole, and then they might miss certain bits. And that might be when we have some sort of focused concentration on one criteria or one set of criteria or one criterion in isolation, because that's just something that they've not been able to articulate very well in their written work. So I can see how it might work then, but when we're looking at the unit as a whole, why should we then dissect it bit by bit? And that's what I'm picking up from your expertise there. So thank you. If we look at grade by grade, I think we've got a very similar pattern, haven't we? So really, grade by grade or grade boundary to grade boundary is a group of criteria, of course. So I can understand during the pandemic that it perhaps has been difficult to motivate students and without breaking down that teaching, learning and assessment into small manageable chunks. I totally get that. And I think we need to be appreciative of that. However, what we also need to be mindful of is, again, the time. Stacey, you mentioned time earlier, so I think that's still important in grade by grade, and also the student's journey that you mentioned, Angie, as well, in terms of, how long is it taking, and that demotivation feeling and repetition when things are actually revisited as the student goes on. So Angie, I just want to come to you first this time, if I may. Can you think of anything, has anything sort of highlighted to you when you think of grade by grade marking or assessment?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Janet. I think what could happen is that you lose the differentiation, because we have to consider the needs of the learners and that they're not all going to reach the A star. And I think we have to consider where those students' abilities lie, give them that opportunity. I'm not saying that, I think that's absolutely great. But there are some students that will find it really challenging. And I think we have to make sure that we've allowed for that differentiation rather than perhaps setting students up to not necessarily fail, but to keep that repetition and keep going, because that can have an effect on their motivation. So I think we have to consider the needs of the learners when we're doing grade to grade.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Stacey, anything you'd like to add to that with those grade boundaries by grade boundary approach?
Yes, completely agree with what Angie has said there. But also, I think we may fall into a trap of teaching the students to pass rather than really teaching a true, deeper understanding of the topic, which isn't always reflective of what the student is learning. But I also think when we talk about demotivation, it's also demotivation of the teachers as well. It can become really demotivating to teach something in that sort of way. So yeah, I think on both sides we need to consider motivation.
Yeah, no, just thinking about that. And obviously, that's something that you have both raised. And I think it's absolutely critical, isn't it, to achievement and to enjoying what we're doing. And if we go grade by grade, I think, yes, and Angie, you're quite right. There is that sort of perhaps expectation that I'll just keep going and I'm going to get an A star and everybody's going to get a distinction or an A star. Not a true reflection. And maybe, then when there is an external piece of work where that extended writing is required, the student doesn't do as well as they have been doing with their internal assessments, and that can be difficult. So there's that to consider. And also, I think with that sort of grade by grade, it could also have the opposite impact. So it could also think, okay, I finished that, I've passed it, I've got a pass, or I've got a D grade. I'm not going to bother doing the rest because, do you know what, I really like what I'm doing over here, and I'm going to work on this unit now. I can't be bothered, or I haven't got the time or motivation to go back to that one. So I think there's all kinds of things in the mix. And when we think about this, I guess what kind of brings it all together and by name as well, is a sort of summative approach. And by that, what you've got is that sort of traditional approach whereby the tutor is teaching the unit. So they're going through that teaching and learning as a whole, and they are leaving the assessment, albeit you've got formative and you can make links to the assessment as you go, but you're covering the whole of the teaching and learning, which prevents, I know we've brought up in conversation today, that perhaps there may be a kind of risk of vulnerability to start to teach to the grade boundary. And let's leave that, and let's think about teaching the whole thing so that the students have got their own understanding at their own individual rate and pace. I know Angie mentioned that differentiation, and they're applying that then to a task that perhaps breaks down the grade boundaries. So it's still in nice little chunks, but they're doing it in sort of at the end as a summative, and that prepares them as well for thinking about something as an extended piece of writing, thinking about something as a whole rather than in lots of sort of disconnected sometimes aspects. So a summative approach would be something like teach the unit, give the task to the students, and of course NCFE for cash qualifications have got those set tasks that you can use. They're non-mandatory, but it's a good starting point, and sometimes they work really well. So those will go through the grade boundary, or you've got an assessment of learning that gives those instructions that can come at the end of the teaching and learning when the richness has happened. And I think the advantages of this, are that the student will apply themselves at their level, at their pace, at their sort of depth of understanding. So it's individualized, and also they're looking and referring to the whole unit, so they've got that richness. And it's the time factor, because that's come up as well. So time and motivation has been clearly woven through this discussion. And I think, typically the student will have a submission date. There might be a couple of weeks, whatever's been agreed within the provider's establishment for marking. Then perhaps another couple of weeks for some internal quality assurance. So within 6 to 8 weeks, that student will have a grade. That student will know where they are. And then there's still opportunity for upgrades and so on. So I think that's probably, when it comes to graded qualifications, a really good way of being able to share these units out across the academic year or the duration of a program, if it's 2 years in length, and really thinking about, when am I going to teach it? Who's going to teach it? When what are the submission dates? So the tutors aren't continually looking at the same pieces of work over and over again. And when you do that, very rarely would you look at that piece of work as a whole. And I think then there is perhaps the risk that looking at the holistic content of a unit is lost, and therefore it becomes rather fragmented as well. So the summative approach for me for graded qualifications appeals. I do think there are opportunities to make sure, criterion by criterion, that students have understood it and that the teaching and learning has covered it. The teacher and the tutor can use that as their benchmark, absolutely. Also, looking at grade by grade, you can give hints and tips when you're teaching. That's going to be really useful for when you do the assignment, and you can make those connections and those links, because the students need to know what they're working towards and what the expectations are, but that you teach the unit as a whole. And I'm getting that those are the sort of key takeaways when we look at a graded qualification. I hope you found the webinar useful, and what we have on here are our contact details. Please do get in touch with us. But it's been really good to be able to talk about the graded qualifications, explore some of the different approaches and how we can perhaps work towards a more summative approach that prepares students for their external assessment and that extended writing and the richness, I think, of the teaching and learning from the whole of the unit. I'd like to thank Stacey and Angie for their expertise, and we hope you found it useful. Thank you very much.